I rented a secluded cabin deep in the mountains for a solo riding retreat. The drive up was long, winding, and rough, the road barely wide enough for one car. The deeper I got into the forest, the thicker the trees became, swallowing the road until it felt like I was tunneling through a wall of green. When I finally arrived, I was greeted by the sight of an old wooden cabin, slightly weathered but charming in a way. It had a porch with a rickety chair, a stone chimney, and a set of large windows that overlooked the thick forest below. The nearest town was an hour away. I stepped inside, the smell of aged wood and something faintly musty filling my lungs. The inside was simple, a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom down the hall. I dropped my bags, checking everything out. There was a hallway with 2 doors. One led to the bedroom, the other was locked with a large, rusted padlock. Curiosity prickled at me. Why would someone lock a door inside a rental cabin? I ran my fingers over the metal, feeling its cold, rough surface. I knocked lightly, half expecting a hollow echo. Instead, I heard nothing, just silence. I shook off the unease and went about my evening, setting up my laptop, making a small meal, and lighting a fire in the stone hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees and whistling through the cracks in the windows. Night settled in quickly, bringing with it an almost oppressive darkness. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden structure shifting. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A sound so subtle that at first, I wasn't even sure I had heard anything at all. A soft thud. It came from the locked door. I sat up on the couch, my heart slowing for just a second before picking up its pace. I told myself the old house was settling. That was normal, right? But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate thump, like something shifting or moving behind the door. I stared at it from across the room, waiting. Nothing else followed. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easy. The next day, I forced myself to ignore the door. I spent my morning writing, pouring coffee after coffee as I sat near the window, watching birds flit between the trees. By afternoon, I had almost forgotten the sound from the night before. Almost. Then, as I was washing dishes, something caught my eye. On the floor, right in front of the locked door, was a small, dark scratch. Like something had scraped against the wood. I was sure it hadn't been there before. A chill crawled up my spine. I kneeled down, inspecting it closely. The mark was fresh. But how? The door had been locked when I arrived, and it wasn't like I had been near it. I ran my fingers over it. Another sound. This time, it wasn't a thump. It was a scrape. A long, slow scrape, like something dragging against the inside of the door. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away, my pulse thundering in my ears. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there wasn't one. There couldn't be. The scraping stopped. I stared at the door for what felt like an eternity. Then the padlock clicked. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound was so sharp, so deliberate, that for a moment I thought someone was on the other side, unlocking it. But when I looked closer, the lock was still there, unmoved. I grabbed my keys and walked straight out of that cabin. I didn't stop until I was in my car, engine running, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I called the owner as soon as I got a signal. He picked up on the 3rd ring, sounding groggy, like I had woken him up. I heard something in the cabin, I said, trying to steady my voice. Behind the locked door. There was a pause. Then he asked, "What door?" My breath caught in my throat. The one at the end of the hallway. The one with the padlock. Another pause. Longer this time. That cabin doesn't have a locked door. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was trying to process what I had just heard. "I don't know what you're talking about," he continued. "I haven't been up there in years, but there's never been a locked door." I turned to look at the cabin, now just a dark shape against the trees. I could still see the hallway from where I had left the door open. And the door. It wasn't there anymore. It started as a simple weekend getaway. My friend James and I had planned it for weeks, 2 nights in a secluded cabin deep in the woods. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. James and I had known each other since high school, and we both needed the break. Life had been pulling us in different directions, and this trip was a chance to reconnect. The drive up was uneventful, a long stretch of winding roads cutting through dense forest. The The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when we finally reached the turnoff to the cabin. The dirt road leading to it was rough, barely more than a trail, but after 15 minutes of slow, careful driving, we arrived. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, rustic, and completely isolated. A wraparound porch faced the trees, and beyond that, nothing but miles of thick woods. No neighbors, no roads nearby, just wilderness. It was perfect. We unloaded our gear, got the firewood stacked, and settled in. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A fireplace, a kitchen with an old gas stove, a small bathroom, and 2 bedrooms with creaky wooden beds. The windows were large, letting in the last golden rays of sunlight. James and I cooked dinner on the old gas stove, grilled some steaks, and sat on the porch with beers in hand, enjoying the silence. "This place is perfect," James said, leaning back in his chair. I nodded. Yeah, exactly what we needed. The woods were quiet, apart from the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt peaceful. That changed around midnight. We had just turned in for the night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. But these weren't the light, erratic steps of a deer or raccoon. These were slow, deliberate, human. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound came from just beyond the tree line, moving steadily toward the cabin. "James," I whispered. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then silence. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe just a branch falling, or an animal shifting through the underbrush. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I told James about what I'd heard. He shrugged it off. Could have been anything. We're in the middle of nowhere. I agreed, but something felt off. The woods were too quiet. The birds, which had been chirping endlessly the evening before, were silent. The air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking. There was a trail a short walk from the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. We followed it for a couple of miles, admiring the untouched beauty of the forest. Then we saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A man stood just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but I could tell he was watching us. James saw him too. "Who the hell is that?" We stood frozen. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring. "Let's go," I muttered. We turned and walked quickly back toward the cabin, glancing over our shoulders. By the time we got back, my skin was crawling. "Maybe he's another camper," James said, trying to sound casual. I shook my head. "There's no one else out here. The rental listing said this whole area is private land. That means no hikers, no campers. Just us." James didn't reply. I could tell he was unnerved too. That night, we locked the doors. We were sitting inside, playing cards, when we heard it, a light tapping on the window. Not the sound of a tree branch or an animal. This was purposeful, rhythmic. James and I froze. Slowly, he reached for the flashlight on the table and clicked it on. We turned toward the window. No one was there. I got up and moved to the door, heart pounding. "Stay here." James grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy?" I hesitated. Then, the tapping came again, this time from the window on the other side of the cabin. My blood went cold. James grabbed the poker from the fireplace, and I picked up a kitchen knife. We moved cautiously to the window. I took a deep breath, then yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. Then James whispered, "Look." I turned and felt my stomach drop. The front door handle was moving. Someone was trying to get in. We backed away from the door, gripping our makeshift weapons. The handle jiggled again. Then silence. James whispered, "We have to do something." I nodded, took a deep breath, and flicked on the porch light. The second the light came on, we saw him, standing just at the edge of the trees. He was closer now, maybe 20 yards away. He stood completely still, head slightly tilted, watching us. He wasn't wearing hiking gear, just dark clothes, dirty and torn. "What the hell do you want?" James yelled. No response. The man didn't move. James took a step forward like he was about to open the door. I yanked him back. "Don't." The man grinned. Then he took a single step back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't sleep that night. At first light, we packed up. As we loaded our bags into the car, I glanced toward the tree line. He was gone. We got in and drove. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, 20 miles away. When we told the gas station clerk what happened, his face paled. "You rented that old cabin?" he asked. "Yeah," he nodded slowly. "You're not the first ones to see him. A couple rented it last year. Same thing happened. They left in the middle of the night. Swore they'd never come back." James and I looked at each other, a chill running down my spine. We drove straight home, never looking back. I'll never go back to that cabin, and I don't think I'll ever camp in the woods again. I needed a break from everything: work, the constant hum of the city, and the unending notifications on my phone. So, when I found a listing for an off-grid hunting cabin deep in the woods, it felt like the perfect escape. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just me and the wilderness for a long weekend. The idea of complete solitude sounded refreshing. The drive out took longer than expected. The last 20 miles were nothing but a narrow dirt road winding through dense forest. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the cabin, an old but well-maintained structure sitting in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. There was a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and most importantly, complete silence. I let out a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. Inside, the cabin was rustic but cozy. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a sitting area with an old wooden rocking chair facing the fireplace. There was a wood stove for heat, a kerosene lantern for light, and a well-stocked shelf of books. The only modern convenience was an old landline phone mounted on the wall near the kitchen. I noted its presence, but didn't think much of it. After all, who would call me here? After unpacking, I spent the evening sitting on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest as the sun dipped below the trees. The chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. It was peaceful. By the time the sky darkened completely, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. At around 10, I went inside, locked the door, and settled into bed. Sleep came quickly, but at exactly 2:13 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. The cabin was silent. The air was cool, the sheets warm. But something felt off. A strange tension in the air. I listened closely, but heard nothing unusual. Just as I started drifting back to sleep, the phone rang. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The sound was sharp, jarring in the quiet cabin. It rang again, and again. Who could possibly be calling? I hesitated, then swung my legs over the bed, making my way to the kitchen. The phone continued to ring. I picked up the receiver, pressing it to my ear. Silence. "Hello," I whispered. Nothing. Just the faint crackling of an empty line. Then, the breathing started. It was slow, shallow, as if someone was just on the other end, listening. I froze, gripping the phone tightly. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Who is this?" I demanded. The breathing stopped. Then the line clicked dead. I stood there, the receiver still in my hand, staring at the wall. My skin prickled. Maybe it was a wrong number, some old connection issue with these ancient landlines. That had to be it. I hung up, exhaling slowly. Shaking off the unease, I returned to bed. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and fell back asleep. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning reading, the afternoon hiking along an overgrown trail behind the cabin. I found an abandoned hunting stand a mile in and sat there for a while, watching the trees sway in the wind. It was peaceful. I returned before sunset, cooked a simple meal on the propane stove, and enjoyed the solitude. By nightfall, I was feeling completely at ease again. Until 2:13 a.m. The phone rang. I sat up immediately, staring into the darkness. My breath came faster. No, not again. But the ringing continued. I swallowed hard, slid out of bed, and walked to the kitchen. My hand hovered over the receiver. It rang one more time before I picked it up. Silence. The breathing returned. This time it was closer. I could almost hear something wet. Lips parting slightly, a faint inhale, exhale. Whoever this was, they weren't speaking. They just listened. My chest tightened. Who the hell is this? I snapped. How do you have this number? A pause. Then, in a slow, raspy whisper. Why are you in my house? A chill ran through me so violently I almost dropped the phone. I slammed the receiver down and stepped back, heart racing. My hands were shaking. It had to be a prank. Some local messing with the out-of-towner. That was the only explanation. I checked the locks, made sure the windows were shut tight. Then I grabbed the fireplace poker and kept it beside my bed. I didn't sleep much that night. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care that I had 2 nights left. I packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and yanked open the front door. But the moment I stepped outside, I stopped cold. The ground in front of the cabin, the soft dirt and pine needles that had been untouched the day before, was covered in footprints. They circled the cabin. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. My throat felt dry. Someone had been out here. All night. I didn't waste another second. I threw my bags in the car, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped off down the dirt road. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, nearly an hour later, that I realized something strange. The cabin's landline wasn't listed anywhere. Not on the rental site. Not in the confirmation email. I had never even given it out. So how had someone known to call? And worse, how did they know I would answer? A few days later, curiosity got the best of me. I contacted the cabin's owner, a middle-aged man who had inherited the place from his grandfather. When I asked about the phone, he went quiet. "That phone shouldn't even be working," he said. "It was disconnected years ago." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Then, who was calling me? He hesitated. "You're not the first to say something like that." I pressed him, but he wouldn't give me details. Just told me that, if I ever wanted to rent the place again, I should probably ignore the phone if it rings. I didn't tell him that I had no intention of ever going back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my buddy Eric, and a remote fishing cabin deep in the wilderness. No cell service, no people, just 2 days of fishing, drinking beer, and disconnecting from the chaos of city life. The drive took longer than expected. The road twisted through dense forest, growing narrower with each mile. We hadn't seen another car for over an hour when we finally reached the cabin. The place was exactly what I expected. Small, rustic, and tucked between towering pines, with a lake stretching out just beyond the back porch. But something felt off the moment we arrived. The front door was unlocked. Eric pushed it open cautiously, and I followed, stepping into a space that should have been empty, but wasn't. A half-eaten plate of food sat on the wooden dining table. A glass of water, still half full, rested beside it. A jacket was draped over the back of a chair. The shower in the tiny bathroom was dripping. "Dude," Eric muttered, "someone's here." I felt my stomach tighten. Maybe the owner forgot to mention they were doing maintenance? Yeah, then why the hell is there fresh food on the table? We hesitated, listening for any signs of movement. Nothing. Eric walked over to the plate of food and touched it. Still warm. That sent a chill through me. Whoever had been here was here recently. Maybe still here. We checked every inch of the cabin. There were 2 small bedrooms, a tiny bathroom, a kitchen, and a living area. All empty. The back door was locked, the windows shut. No signs of forced entry. It was as if someone had been here, but just vanished. "Should we leave?" I asked. Eric shrugged. "Dude, we paid for this place. Maybe the owner double-booked or something. If someone shows up, we'll deal with it." I wasn't convinced, but leaving meant a long drive back in the dark. So we unpacked, storing our gear in the second bedroom. The unease lingered, but after a few beers and setting up our fishing rods by the lake, we started to relax. The eerie feeling faded into the background, replaced by the quiet of the woods and the rhythmic lapping of water against the dock. As night fell, we locked the doors and settled into the living room, the fireplace crackling warmly. "I swear, if some dude shows up in the middle of the night, I'm swinging first, asking questions later," Eric joked. I laughed, but it didn't feel funny. Something about this place still didn't sit right with me. At around midnight, we called it a night. I took the smaller bedroom, while Eric crashed in the main one. The bed was stiff but decent enough. I lay awake for a while, listening to the silence outside, trying to shake the unease. Then, at some point, I drifted off. I woke up to a noise. A soft, subtle scraping sound. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But as I held my breath, ears straining, I heard it again. Scrape. 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 It was coming from inside the cabin. My body went rigid. The sound was faint, but it was there, something moving, slow and deliberate. My eyes flicked toward the door. It was closed, but a sliver of dim light from the hallway crept underneath. I reached for my phone. No signal. Holding my breath, I slowly slid out of bed and tiptoed to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Moving through the living room. My heart pounded against my ribs. I turned the doorknob as quietly as I could and cracked the door open, peering into the hallway. No one there. But I could hear it, something shifting in the other room. Eric. I crept toward his door, barely breathing. Just as I reached for the knob, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, rhythmic breathing. But it wasn't coming from Eric's room. It was coming from under the couch in the living room. I froze. The air felt thick, heavy. The breathing was slow, almost careful, as if whoever, or whatever, was under there didn't want to be heard. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. My hand shook as I reached for Eric's door. That's when the breathing stopped, and the footsteps started again. But this time they were running. Straight for me. I barely had time to react before I slammed into Eric's door, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. I turned, heart hammering, expecting to see something, someone charging toward me. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Eric groggily sat up. Dude, what the hell? There's someone in here. That woke him up fast. What? We grabbed our flashlights and checked every inch of the cabin. Under the couch, in the closets, even in the tiny attic space above the kitchen. No one. But the front door, which we had locked, was wide open. Neither of us slept the rest of the night. At first light, we packed up, threw everything into the car, and peeled out of there. On the way back, I texted the cabin owner, demanding an explanation. Hours later, I got a reply. That's impossible. That cabin hasn't been rented out in months. Eric and I never spoke about it again. But sometimes late at night, I think about that half-eaten plate of food, the fresh jacket on the chair, the breathing under the couch. And I wonder, were we ever actually alone? It started the first night. I was staying in an old rental cabin deep in the woods, a secluded place I had found online for a weekend getaway. The listing described it as cozy and charming, with rustic wooden floors and an antique fireplace. It looked like the perfect retreat from my hectic life. The drive out was long and winding, miles away from the nearest town. The closer I got, the less maintained the roads became, turning from pavement to gravel to packed dirt. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the cabin's dark wooden exterior. It was nestled among towering pines, with a narrow path leading down to a small lake a few hundred yards away. No neighbors, no traffic, just silence, except for the distant sound of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. The key was under a flower pot, just as the owner had said in his email. The door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior with wooden beams, a few mismatched pieces of furniture, and a large rug covering most of the floor. Dust particles floated in the air where the evening light filtered through the windows. It smelled of aged wood and something else, something faintly musty, like a place that hadn't been aired out in a while. I dropped my bag on the couch and did a quick walk-through. The cabin was small, a living area with a fireplace, a kitchen with an old gas stove, a tiny bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a single bedroom with a heavy wooden door. The floor was made of thick, uneven planks, the kind that groaned under your weight no matter how carefully you walked. By the time I settled in, it was dark outside. I lit a fire, made some tea, and stretched out on the couch with a book. I was starting to relax when I heard it for the first time. A creak. It came from the hallway near the front door. I paused, listening, but heard nothing else. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. Old wood shifts as the temperature drops. I went back to my book. A few minutes later, another creak. This time closer. I sat up, suddenly alert. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The wind had picked up outside, whispering through the trees, but inside, the air was still. Then another sound. A slow, deliberate creak, as if someone had shifted their weight just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. My heart pounded in my ears. Slowly, I stood up, forcing myself to move toward the hallway. I flipped on the light switch, illuminating the narrow space. The front door was still locked. The windows were closed. Nothing looked out of place. I shook off the nerves and told myself I was being paranoid. It was an old cabin. Of course it made noise. I locked my bedroom door that night, though I tried not to think too hard about why. The second night, it got worse. I spent the day hiking a nearby trail, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. By the time I got back, exhaustion won out over paranoia, and I convinced myself I had imagined everything the night before. But at exactly 2:13 a.m., the creaking started again. This time, it was unmistakable. It began at the front door, just like before. A slow, rhythmic groan of wood shifting under weight. Step by step, it moved down the hallway, toward the kitchen. I lay frozen in bed, listening as it passed my room, continued past the living area, then stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, creak. This time, right outside my bedroom door. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. My fingers hovered over the flashlight function, but I was too scared to turn it on. Instead, I listened. Nothing. No movement. No breathing. Just the heavy quiet pressing in from all sides. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't sleep. By the third night, I had decided I was leaving first thing in the morning. It wasn't just the sounds. It was the feeling, the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. That someone was inside the cabin with me. I packed my bag before nightfall, setting it by the door so I could leave at first light. I kept the fireplace burning and every light on. I refused to let myself fall asleep. But exhaustion caught up with me sometime around 1 a.m., and I drifted off on the couch. A noise woke me. Not a creak this time. A whisper. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But then, creak. This time, I knew I wasn't dreaming. The sound came from the hallway again. Slow, steady, deliberate. Closer. My breath came in shallow gasps. I reached for my bag, inching toward the door as quietly as I could. Another step. Another groan of wood. I gripped the doorknob, turning it as slowly as possible. The front door was still locked. My hands were shaking too hard to get the key in. Creak. The floorboards right behind me. I threw the door open and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. Finally, the engine roared to life. I hit the gas and didn't slow down until I was miles away. The next day, I called the owner, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. He listened in silence. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he sighed and said, "That's why I don't stay there anymore." I asked him what he meant. He hesitated, then finally said, "You're not the first guest to leave early. That cabin, it's old. Real old. My grandfather built it. Spent his last years there, mostly alone. After he passed, we found footprints inside, even though no one had been there for months. My dad boarded the place up for a while, but, well, people still hear things." I asked him, barely able to get the words out, "Did your grandfather die in that cabin?" Another pause. "Not exactly." "What does that mean?" The owner exhaled slowly. "They never found him. Just his boots, sitting by the fireplace. The floorboards creaked that night, too." I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A solo getaway to a secluded cabin, deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful retreat, just me, my thoughts, and nature. The drive out there had been long, a good 4 hours on highways before I turned onto an old, winding back road that led deeper into the forest. The last hour of the drive was nothing but trees, the road narrowing as I climbed higher into the hills. The cabin itself was old but well-maintained. A simple wooden structure with a stone chimney, a small front porch, and a single dim porch light. No neighbors, no traffic, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, something caught my eye. Parked just off the road, about 20 yards from the cabin's entrance, was an old, beat-up car. An old sedan, dark in color, with rust eating away at the edges. The headlights were off, and no one was inside. It just sat there, motionless, as if someone had abandoned it. I slowed my own car to a stop, staring at the vehicle for a moment. There were no visible signs of recent movement, no tire tracks in the gravel, no footprints in the dirt. It didn't look like it had been driven recently, yet it wasn't overgrown with weeds or covered in leaves either. It was just there. A little unsettled, but not wanting to let paranoia ruin my weekend, I dismissed it as an old car someone had left behind. Maybe a hunter's vehicle, or a local who had taken a walk into the woods and planned to return later. I parked in front of the cabin, gathered my bags, and carried them inside. The place was simple, a main living area with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. Rustic but comfortable. The silence was thick, the kind of quiet that city life never allows. I exhaled deeply, already feeling more relaxed. As dusk settled, I cooked a simple meal and sat on the porch, listening to the wind and the faint rustling of animals moving through the underbrush. Then, I glanced toward the road. The car was gone. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. The empty patch of dirt where it had been parked looked undisturbed, as if the vehicle had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. It had been there just a few hours ago, and now nothing. My rational brain tried to explain it away. Maybe someone had come back and quietly driven off. Maybe I had just been too distracted unpacking to notice them leaving. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I felt a creeping unease settle into my chest. Shaking it off, I told myself I was overthinking things. I finished my dinner, locked the doors, and settled into bed early. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. The cabin was completely dark, except for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. I lay there for a moment, listening. The forest was silent. Too silent. No crickets. No wind. Then I heard it. A car engine. I bolted upright in bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The low, steady hum of an idling vehicle was unmistakable. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. The old car was back. Same spot. Same rusted exterior. Only this time, the driver's side door was wide open. I stared at it, breath shallow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The car was facing away from the cabin, so I couldn't see if anyone was inside. But the door, why was it open? I hadn't heard footsteps. No one had knocked. No voices. Just the hum of the engine, steady and unchanging. A deep, primal instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to not go out there, to not investigate. But my curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to know. Needed to know. Grabbing a flashlight from my bag, I cautiously opened the front door, stepping onto the porch. The cold night air sent a shiver down my spine. I aimed the beam of light at the car. Empty. The driver's seat was vacant. The interior was dark and still. But the engine was running. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. The open door creaked slightly in the breeze. Then, as I reached the halfway point between the cabin and the car, the engine cut off. Silence. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. My flashlight trembled slightly in my grip as I swept the beam over the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I had two choices: investigate further, or get the hell back inside. Every instinct told me to turn around. So I did. I backed away, keeping my light on the car until I reached the porch. The second I stepped inside, I locked the door, bolted it shut, and grabbed the old hunting knife from the kitchen drawer. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair, facing the window, watching. By morning, the car was gone again. I didn't waste any time. I threw my things into my bag and got the hell out of there. As I sped down the road, my heart pounded, my mind racing. When I reached the main highway, I finally allowed myself to breathe. It was over. But 2 days later, when I got home, I found a single note slipped under my apartment door. I liked watching you sleep. I moved the next day. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week of absolute solitude in a remote cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me, a few good books, and nature. It was exactly what I needed after a stressful year. The cabin was old but well kept, nestled between tall pines and set against the backdrop of rolling hills. The rental ad had promised peace and quiet, and the moment I stepped onto the wooden porch, I believed it. The silence was almost unnerving, the kind that made your ears ring when you weren't used to it. I unloaded my supplies, locked the door behind me, and made myself comfortable. The first night was uneventful. Just the occasional rustling of leaves outside, the hoot of an owl, the normal sounds of the woods at night. I slept deeply, wrapped in the comfort of knowing that for the first time in ages, I didn't have to worry about work or responsibilities. But the second night was different. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was pitch black except for the faint outline of moonlight seeping through the curtains. My breathing was slow, my mind groggy. But then I heard it. SCRCH, SCRCH. A faint, slow scratching sound coming from behind the walls. I turned onto my side, listening carefully. The sound was steady, rhythmic, like something with nails dragging against wood. It wasn't mice. I had dealt with mice before in my old apartment, and this was too deliberate, too controlled. I sat up, straining to hear more. The sound stopped. Silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the house settling, maybe a tree branch scraping against the side of the cabin. I went back to sleep, not realizing it would be much worse the next night. The following evening, I made a fire in the small stone fireplace and sat in the flickering warmth reading. The book was good, but I kept getting distracted, my eyes darting toward the walls, my ears straining for any noise. It was as if my body knew something was off before my mind could catch up. I went to bed early, hoping to shake off the unease. But around the same time as the night before, I woke up again. SCRCH, SCRCH, SCRCH. This time, the sound was louder, more insistent. I held my breath. It came from the same spot, behind the wall near the foot of the bed. I pressed my palm against the wooden paneling. The scratching stopped instantly. A chill ran down my spine. I waited. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear any movement, any sign of whatever was causing the noise. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to relax. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I turned on my side and pulled the blanket up to my chin. Maybe it was some kind of nocturnal animal, squirrels, raccoons, even bats. I'd check in the morning. The third night, something is inside. By the third night, I was on edge. I had checked the exterior of the cabin earlier that day and found no signs of animals. No burrowed holes, no droppings, nothing. It made no sense. I tried to shake it off. I cooked dinner, read by the fire, and even had a drink to calm my nerves. But the moment I lay down to sleep, the scratching began again. SCRCH, SCRCH, SCRCH. But this time, it moved. The sound started at the foot of my bed, as before. But after a few moments, it traveled up the wall. Slowly, deliberately, as if something inside the walls was climbing. I sat up, gripping the blanket. My pulse pounded in my ears. The sound reached the ceiling, and then silence. I barely slept that night, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I searched the cabin again, knocking against the walls, listening for anything unusual. Nothing. The walls were solid. The attic, if you could call it that, was just an empty crawl space barely big enough for a person to fit. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The fourth night, the hole. I almost left that day. But the rational part of me, the part that didn't want to seem paranoid, told me I was being ridiculous. I was an adult, not a child scared of the dark. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I put my flashlight next to my pillow, along with the hunting knife I had brought, just in case. I lay in bed waiting. And sure enough, just past midnight, it began again. SCRCH, SCRCH, SCRCH. It moved faster this time, as if it knew I was listening. It started at the foot of the bed, climbed the wall, and then, a soft creak. I turned on my flashlight, heart hammering. My eyes darted to the ceiling, to the floor, to the corners of the room. Then I saw it. A small hole in the wooden paneling. Near the baseboard, just big enough for a few fingers to slip through. And as I stared, frozen in horror, something moved inside it. I didn't think. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and sprinted out of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, peeling out onto the dark road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I called the rental owner the next day and told him what had happened. He went silent for a moment before saying, "You weren't supposed to stay in that cabin. It was supposed to be boarded up." I never got an explanation. I never went back. And to this day, I still wonder, what was inside the walls? I booked the cabin on a whim. Work had been crushing me lately, my apartment felt suffocating, and I needed a break from the city. The listing described it as a rustic, off-grid retreat with breathtaking views of the forest and complete solitude. That sounded perfect. I didn't need cell service, Wi-Fi, or even running water. Just peace and quiet for a long weekend. The drive was longer than I expected. After 3 hours on the highway, I spent another hour on winding dirt roads, climbing deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew denser, the sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, but I had printed directions, and according to them, I was close. Finally, I spotted a wooden sign nailed to a tree. Cabin 17. I turned onto the barely visible trail, my tires crunching on gravel. The cabin appeared at the end of the path, a small structure nestled between towering pines. It looked old but well-maintained. A simple porch, a single window in the front, and a slanted roof covered in moss. There were no signs of recent visitors. Perfect. I parked, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no ringing phone. Just the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. I grabbed my bag and stepped onto the porch. The key was in the agreed-upon spot, under a loose plank. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was as rustic as I expected. A small wood-burning stove, a creaky wooden table, and a single bed with a thick quilt. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, dusty knickknacks, and a few lanterns. No electricity, but that was part of the charm. I set down my bag and checked out the kitchen. Just a sink with a pump and a few cabinets stocked with canned goods. As I explored, I noticed a desk against the far wall. On it sat a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. It looked like it had been there for years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat down, flipping to the first page. The handwriting was small and neat, dated almost a decade ago. May 14th, 2013. I arrived today. The cabin is just as I remember, isolated, peaceful. I need this time away. The silence is comforting. I feel safe here. I turned the pages, scanning more entries. The writer had stayed here for long periods, returning again and again. He mentioned enjoying the solitude, watching the wildlife, and the comfort of routine. But as I flipped ahead, the tone shifted. September 3rd, 2014. Something strange happened last night. I woke up to knocking on the door. Just a few soft taps. When I opened it, no one was there. I told myself it was the wind. I felt a slight chill but kept reading. September 7th, 2014. The knocking happened again. This time, it was louder. I stayed in bed, pretending not to hear it. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Barefoot, too large for an animal. I swallowed hard. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now. The next few entries were scattered thoughts. The writer started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. He talked about locking the door and checking the windows repeatedly. October 1st, 2014. I woke up and the door was open. I know I locked it. I am not alone out here. I closed the journal, my fingers tightening around the cover. A deep unease settled in my stomach. Was this some kind of story? A prank? I looked around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound outside. The trees pressed in close, their branches shifting slightly in the wind. I shook my head. It was just a journal, probably left behind by someone with an overactive imagination. I set it back down and forced myself to focus on unpacking. I wasn't going to let some old scribblings ruin my trip. Night fell quickly. I lit a few lanterns and made a simple meal. The cabin felt cozy, the fire crackling softly. I almost forgot about the journal until I was lying in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. The words replayed in my head. I woke up and the door was open. I got up and checked the lock. Secure. The windows too. I was alone. I crawled back under the covers, trying to shake the unease. At some point, I drifted off. A sound woke me. Soft, deliberate, knocking. My eyes snapped open. The sound was coming from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath. The knocking was slow, patient. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. My phone was useless out here. There was no way to call for help. Knock, knock. I reached for the lantern, my fingers shaking. The knocking stopped. I strained to hear, but the forest outside was deathly silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I crept toward the door, heart pounding. I pressed my eye to the peephole. Nothing. Just darkness. I exhaled shakily. Maybe an animal had bumped the door. Maybe I was psyching myself out. I turned back toward the bed. And then I saw it. The journal was open. I had closed it before bed. I was sure of it. But now, a new page was exposed, and my blood ran cold as I read the fresh ink. They knocked again tonight. I think they want to come in. The handwriting wasn't the same as before. I grabbed my keys and bolted. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I wasn't staying another second. I threw my bag into the car and peeled out down the gravel road, my headlights barely cutting through the darkness. My heart didn't stop hammering until I saw the distant glow of a gas station hours later. The next day, I messaged the owner, asking about the journal. He replied quickly, "What journal?" I never went back. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a quiet weekend away. It wasn't the first time I'd taken a solo trip like this. I enjoyed solitude, the sound of wind through the trees, the crackling of a fire at night. No internet, no distractions, just me, my thoughts, and a few books. The cabin itself was simple. A single-story structure with a peaked roof, made of old, dark-stained wood. Inside, there was a living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom with an old-fashioned clawfoot tub. A single large mirror hung above the sink, framed in tarnished silver. The whole place smelled faintly of pine and something older, something musty. The first day passed without incident. I unpacked my bag, made a simple meal, and spent the evening reading by the fire. It wasn't until I got ready for bed that I noticed something strange. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of something off. At first, I couldn't place it. It wasn't anything obvious. The lighting in the cabin was dim, the bulbs casting a warm, yellowish hue. My reflection looked normal. But when I moved, there was the faintest hesitation, an almost imperceptible lag, like an old video buffering. My mind told me it was just fatigue, my eyes playing tricks on me. I rinsed my mouth, shook my head, and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the wind howling outside. The trees swayed, their shadows flickering across the walls like grasping fingers. I listened for a moment, then rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I brewed coffee and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. I sat for a while, enjoying the peace. After breakfast, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin, following an overgrown path that led deeper into the forest. I marked my way with small piles of stones, careful not to get lost. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to dip below the treeline. I made dinner, built a fire, and settled in with my book. The uneasiness from the night before had faded. The cabin felt warm and safe. That night, when I went to the bathroom to wash up, the feeling returned. As I splashed water on my face and looked up at the mirror, I felt it again, that subtle lag. This time, I paid closer attention. I lifted my hand slowly. My reflection did the same, but just a fraction of a second too late. Not much, just enough to make my stomach twist with unease. I moved side to side. The reflection followed. It wasn't obvious, nothing I could pinpoint, but I felt it, like something watching me, mimicking me instead of simply reflecting. I shook my head, exhaled sharply. "You're imagining things." My voice sounded too loud in the small bathroom, but the feeling didn't leave me. I left the light on when I went to bed. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I had been overreacting. Sleep deprivation, isolation, both could make the mind play tricks. Still, an unease settled deep in my gut, like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I spent the day outside, chopping firewood, hiking along the narrow dirt trails, and letting the fresh air clear my head. When I returned to the cabin, I forced myself not to glance at the mirror. I refused to give in to paranoia. That resolve lasted until nightfall. When I stood in front of the sink that evening, brushing my teeth, my body tensed involuntarily. I moved cautiously, trying not to let my nerves get the best of me. Then it happened. As I turned my head to the right, something in the mirror was wrong. My reflection turned its head at the same time, but the angle was slightly off, just enough to send a shiver down my spine. I took a step back. My reflection did too. I lifted my hand slowly, fingers trembling, and waved. It waved back. A perfect imitation. But there was something off about the eyes. Not in an obvious way. No glowing pupils, no monstrous grin. Just a difference. Subtle. Indistinct. Wrong. I snapped off the bathroom light and stumbled out into the hallway, heart pounding. I told myself I was being irrational, but my body didn't believe me. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I left the door slightly ajar, refusing to look at the mirror again. Lying in bed, I told myself I was exhausted, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I barely slept. I woke up feeling drained, my limbs heavy with fatigue. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving the cabin cold and unwelcoming. I dressed quickly, avoiding the bathroom entirely. I needed to leave. As I packed my bag, I kept glancing toward the bathroom door. It was still slightly ajar. The mirror was just out of sight. I told myself not to look, to just get my things and go. But I couldn't resist. I took a slow step toward the bathroom, heart hammering. I leaned just enough to see my reflection. It was waiting. I froze. My reflection stood there, eyes locked on mine. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. I was standing at an angle, but the reflection faced me directly, shoulders squared, staring. I bolted. Grabbing my bag, I ran for the door, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the wall. Cold air hit me as I stumbled onto the porch. My car was parked just a few feet away. I threw my bag in the back and fumbled for the keys. The cabin was silent behind me. I refused to look back. I refused to see if my reflection was still standing there, watching. The engine roared to life. I reversed down the narrow driveway, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As soon as I hit the main road, I floored it, leaving that cabin, and whatever had been in that mirror, far behind me. It took hours before I finally pulled over at a gas station, my hands still shaking. I splashed water on my face in the restroom, avoiding the mirror altogether. I never told anyone what happened. How could I? I had no proof, nothing but a gut feeling and the lingering terror in my bones. A week later, I looked up the cabin's listing online. It was gone. The owner had removed it. No trace of it ever being rented. I never went back. But sometimes late at night, when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I swear, just for a second, it's still watching. I booked a cabin deep in the woods for a week-long retreat, hoping to disconnect from the world and find some peace. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, tucked away at the end of a narrow dirt road. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind whistling through the branches. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time reading, cooking simple meals, and taking long naps on the cabin's rickety porch. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and I was eager to explore it. On the third morning, I decided to go for a hike. The owner had mentioned a well-marked trail just behind the cabin, leading to a small clearing with a stunning view of the valley. It sounded like the perfect way to spend the afternoon. I packed a bottle of water, a snack, and my pocket knife, then stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. I found the trail easily. It was wide and well-trodden, cutting neatly through the dense trees. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with golden patches. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth signaled the presence of small animals. It felt safe. I walked for about an hour, following the path as it wound deeper into the woods. The hike was pleasant, not too steep, and I enjoyed the solitude. Eventually, I reached the clearing the owner had mentioned. It was beautiful. The trees parted, revealing a panoramic view of rolling hills, their peaks dusted with mist. I sat on a fallen log and took it all in, feeling completely at peace. After resting for a while, I decided to head back. I turned around and started walking. The forest was quieter now, the chirping birds replaced by an eerie stillness. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked, I realized something strange. The trail seemed different. The trees, which had been familiar and welcoming on my way in, now loomed taller, their branches tangled together like skeletal fingers. The undergrowth, which had been sparse, was now thick and overgrown, as if the forest had aged in just an hour. I frowned and picked up my pace. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were no footprints. I had been the only person on the trail, yet my own tracks, so clearly imprinted in the damp soil when I arrived, were gone. The ground looked untouched, as if no one had walked this way in years. A cold wave of unease washed over me. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had wandered slightly off course. Maybe the shifting light was playing tricks on my eyes. I forced myself to stay calm and kept walking, following what I thought was the correct path. But the further I went, the more things felt wrong. The trees grew denser, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like traps waiting to ensnare me. The air became thick, heavy with an unnatural silence. My footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest was absorbing the sound. Then I saw it. A tree, a massive gnarled oak, standing directly in the middle of the path. I hadn't seen it before. There was no way I had passed it on my way in. It was impossible to miss, its thick, knotted trunk splitting the trail in two. My breath quickened. I turned around, convinced I had taken a wrong turn. But when I did, my heart nearly stopped. The path behind me was gone. There was nothing but dense, unbroken forest. No trail, no footprints, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I spun in a slow circle, panic rising in my throat. This wasn't right. I reached for my phone, even though I knew there was no service. Still, the comfort of holding it in my hand steadied me. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. I had to retrace my steps. If I had walked into this clearing, there had to be a way out. I picked a direction and started walking, forcing myself to stay calm. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. No matter which way I went, the forest stretched on endlessly, unchanging. The sun, once bright, was now obscured by thick clouds, casting everything in a dull gray light. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, distant but deliberate. Not the wind, something moving, watching. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound came again, closer this time. I swallowed hard, gripping my pocket knife. "Hello." My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. No answer. The rustling continued, circling me. I turned wildly, trying to pinpoint the source, but the forest was too thick. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence pressed down on me, suffocating. I was not alone. I forced myself to keep walking. I had to find a way out. As I pushed forward, I noticed something up ahead, a structure. Relief flooded through me. A ranger station? Another cabin? I ran toward it. But when I got closer, my blood ran cold. It was my cabin. I had made a full circle, even though I had walked for hours in what I thought was a straight line. My stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. Something was wrong with these woods. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted up the steps, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. My heart pounded as I locked every door and window. The silence outside felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was listening. I sat on the floor, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Had I imagined it all? Was I just disoriented? I didn't know. I only knew one thing for certain. I wasn't leaving that cabin again. Not until morning. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about my reservation. I didn't care about the refund. I drove away and never looked back. Later, when I told the cabin owner what had happened, his face turned pale. He hesitated, then said something that still haunts me. That trail was closed years ago. It shouldn't have been there at all. I had always been drawn to the idea of solitude. A weekend away from the noise of the city, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind through the branches. I found a listing for a remote cabin deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from town. The pictures showed a rustic wooden structure, nothing fancy, but it had what I needed: a bed, a small kitchenette, and a fireplace. The listing emphasized its isolation. No nearby neighbors, no cell service, just pure nature. It sounded perfect. The drive up was long and winding. The further I went, the worse the road became. Asphalt turned to gravel, then to dirt, and finally just 2 worn tire tracks through thick forest. My car wasn't built for rough terrain, but I managed to navigate the bumps and dips without too much trouble. The sun was beginning to set when I finally saw the cabin through the trees. It looked just like the pictures, small, weathered, sitting in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I grabbed my bag, locked the car out of habit, and walked up the creaky wooden steps to the door. The key was where the owner had said it would be, hidden beneath a loose board on the porch. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a fireplace on one side, a small table, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The kitchen area was just a counter with an old propane stove and a basin sink. A single window overlooked the trees. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I wanted. I set my bag down and started getting settled. The first thing I did was check the fireplace. Nights in the mountains got cold, and I didn't want to be fumbling around in the dark trying to start a fire. There was a small pile of firewood stacked against the wall. I arranged some kindling, struck a match, and soon had a warm glow flickering in the hearth. By the time I finished eating a quick meal, the last light outside had faded. Darkness pressed against the windows. There were no curtains, and I could see nothing beyond the glass except my own reflection in the dim firelight. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no city sounds. Just the occasional crack of the fire and the rustle of wind in the trees. I sat in front of the fire for a while, enjoying the quiet. Eventually, fatigue set in. I turned off my flashlight, climbed into bed, and pulled the thick blankets over me. The warmth from the fire filled the small space, making it cozy. Sleep came quickly. I woke up to a noise. A sharp, distinct sound just outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the trees shifting in the breeze. Then I heard it again. A crunching sound. Footsteps. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the cabin walls. I felt my heartbeat thudding in my chest. Animals made noise in the woods, sure, but this wasn't the random movement of a deer or a raccoon. It was too steady, too controlled. I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then, after a long pause, the creak of wood. Something was on the porch. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Who else would be out here? No one was supposed to be anywhere near this cabin. I had driven miles down an unmarked road to get here. A soft tapping sound broke the silence. Not a knock, just the lightest brush of something against the door. My skin crawled. I reached for my flashlight, but stopped. I didn't want to make any noise, didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. Minutes passed. The tapping stopped. I kept waiting for more movement, for another sound. But there was nothing. The fire crackled softly, and the wind whispered through the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever had been outside had left. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slowly. As soon as the first light touched the trees, I got up and cautiously opened the door. The porch was empty. The clearing looked the same as before. But then I noticed something. On the ground near the steps, faint footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows before leading back into the trees. I packed my bag immediately. I had planned to stay the whole weekend, but there was no way I was spending another night out here. I doused the fire, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The air was cold and still. I locked the cabin door behind me, even though it hardly mattered. Whoever had been out here hadn't needed to come inside to make their presence known. The drive back felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees made my skin crawl. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. When I finally reached the main highway, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Civilization. Cars, buildings, people. Safety. The tension in my body didn't fade until I was back in my own apartment, doors locked, city sounds filling the space around me. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked the owner about it. Some things are better left alone. But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping against my window, I wonder, was it really just some stranger wandering the woods, or had something followed me home?